What is up guys, Blue Spooky here with another 2-hour Megamix. If you guys are enjoying these daily uploads and these longer 2-hour videos, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you end up enjoying this one. If we could aim for 1,500 likes on these longer videos, that would be a good milestone to aim for. It all helps the channel to grow and the videos to do well, to ensure I can keep doing these for a long time to come. If you guys have any thoughts about the stories in this video, please be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments below, as my favorite part about doing these is reading your guys' thoughts. Without further ado, I will let you enjoy the next 2 hours or so of true scary stories, and I hope you guys have a great day. I'll see you again at the end of the video. In my college, all freshmen had to live in the dorms, and they had to live in either a double or a triple. I was a bit nervous about sharing the room with another person, and this only got even worse when I met the guy to be my roommate. This guy was named Kyle, and Kyle was really weird. He was sort of dark. I don't mean to say he was a goth or anything like that, because that's not really what I mean. I mean, yeah, he did wear dark clothes and had dark makeup as well, but he was just so weird. He took it to a level that was much more than just an odd fashion statement here and there. He was involved with what he believed to be witchcraft, and I'm not just talking about Wicca or that sort of thing. He called the witchcraft he believed in black magic, and very often referred to entities he would pray to, and demons and that sort of thing. Now, I'm not particularly religious or anything, but everything he did just made me really uncomfortable. Things with Kyle were at first just annoying. He would always be awake at all times of night, and I always had to be up early for class the next day. He would sit at this little altar thing he'd made and talk to these demons by candlelight. He kept me awake all throughout the night, so I took to wearing earplugs and an eye mask to try and get at least some sleep. One night, though, I was woken up by a lot of noise that even my earplugs couldn't keep out. When I peeked out from under my mask, Kyle was having a three-way with another girl and guy on his bed. I just put my mask back on and pretended I'd never seen anything. So far, it had only been minor annoyances, but it turned very scary one day. I got home from class, and Kyle, who usually didn't pay much attention to me before, seemed really excited to see me. He told me he was communicating with one of his demons, and he needed someone's blood in order to do this further. He just straight up asked me if he could have some of mine. I turned him down, of course, and he insisted it would not hurt at all. I told him I wasn't really concerned about the pain. I didn't want him to use my blood for some nefarious ritual or something. He just kept on begging for my blood for a while, but I didn't relent at all. When he gave up finally, I could tell he was extremely pissed off at me. I didn't really care though, because at least he left me alone for the rest of the night. As usual that night, I went to bed with my earplugs and my mask on. I'm not sure how long I'd been sleeping before I felt a sudden and sharp pain surge up in my arm. I jumped up in bed, ripping my eye mask off immediately. There was a large slash in my arm, and Kyle was kneeling next to my bed, holding a ceremonial knife. The guy had actually sliced me open and started to collect my blood in my sleep. Enraged, I kicked him in the head, which knocked him down to the floor. I kicked the knife out of his hand and ran out the door. I ran straight to the RAS room and pounded on the door frantically. She answered and saw the huge slash in my arm. She called the campus police. Kyle was arrested soon after, and you can be damn sure I pressed charges against him. I know after he was taken out of my room, and I assume he was removed from the school as well. I don't technically know for sure exactly what happened though. I'm just happy I never saw that psychopath again though. I knew right away I was gonna have problems when I started living in the dorms. Growing up, I'd always had a room of my own, and being with another person was gonna be pretty hard to get used to already. When I first met my new roommate, he was actually a really nice guy. His name was Josh, and we got along really well. Still, it was difficult for me to always have another person hanging around all the time. There was definitely no privacy for me anymore in these small rooms either. About a month after I'd moved in, I was up studying late at night. Josh had been deep asleep for a while, when suddenly he just rose out of his bed like a zombie. He was only wearing his boxers. He got up and walked out of the room in his underwear. He didn't come back for about an hour. I tried to ask him where he'd gone like that, but he ignored me and went back to his bed, sleeping right away. The next day, I brought this up to him, and he told me he used to sleepwalk when he was little. He hadn't done this in a really long time, but had been concerned that he would start up again. He had a feeling it would start up when he went to college and added more stress to his life. He told me it was normally not that big a deal. He'd just walk and wander around for a bit and then head back to bed. He said it would be fine if I wanted to wake him up if I did anything weird. Apparently the rule that you're not supposed to wake up a sleepwalker isn't really true. Over the next few weeks, Josh did sleepwalk a few more times. I did wake him up once or twice when I thought he might get into some trouble. Sometimes, however, I couldn't. He would leave while I was sleeping, and when he came back into the room was generally when I would wake up. Anyway, the sleepwalking really wasn't that big of a deal until one particular night. Like I mentioned, it would almost always just involve him walking around in his boxers, but one night it took a really odd turn. I was deep in sleep when I began to hear some strange noises, which woke me up pretty quickly. I was still groggy and not able to pay that much attention to it until I heard the sound of something hitting the floor. Opening my eyes, I was immediately shocked. Josh had just opened the window and taken the screen off of it. He was climbing onto the windowsill of our second-story dorm room window. I jumped up to try and stop him, but before I could do anything, he fell out of the window as if it were nothing. Freaked out, I ran over and looked down. Josh was lying there in his boxers on the ground. There were a few students outside who had been unlucky enough to witness this. I ran out of the dorm still in just my boxers and sprinted down the stairs. I told the people around him that I was his roommate and that he was a sleepwalker. Fortunately, he survived the fall. Apparently, he'd landed on his feet, and the shock of the fall completely shattered both of his legs. Josh was okay and didn't remember anything about what had happened, or at least as okay as you can be with two completely shattered legs. I know this might not seem as scary to some of you, but you just need to imagine this picture. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night and seeing your best friend jumping out of a second-story window with no cause, as if it were nothing. I was absolutely terrified. I'm sure you've heard this sort of story 100 times before, but I think this one might be just a little bit weirder than most. Mostly that's because I live in a very rural area, and when this happened, I was in fact living out on a ridge all by myself. I won't give the name of this ridge though. I'd rather keep this strange story anonymous and not allow people to find my location. My house was way up on a hill, and was about a 20-minute drive from the next closest house. We had a huge big yard, and on a clear night, you could see just about the entire Milky Way clearly. It was so dark out there, and there were no polluting lights around. Growing up in that house was great, other than that I had to get up nearly 2 hours before school started, because the bus needed a long time to get there and back. Other than that, it was pretty nice though. This happened when I was 13 years old. My parents were visiting my grandmother, and I decided not to go with them this time. Usually, I'd get pretty bored when I went there, so I stayed in the house by myself instead. I was curled up on the couch in the living room and watching various horror movies late into the night. At one point, I got a sudden phone call. I didn't think to ask who it was. It was someone who wanted to speak to my father. He didn't ask for my father by name, though. He just asked, "Hey, is your dad home?" I stupidly told him no, and that he wouldn't be home for a few days yet. The guy didn't even offer to leave a message and just hung up immediately. I very quickly put the incident out of my mind, but about an hour later, towards the end of a very scary movie, I was startled by a sudden knock at the door. I was even more surprised because I hadn't seen the lights of a car pulling up into the driveway. It would have been very obvious if someone had driven up here. I looked over at the clock and saw it was about 11 p.m. I think anyone, especially someone who lives in a rural area, would be a bit freaked out by someone suddenly coming to knock on the door this late at night. I didn't know how to react. I thought the best idea was to just not answer the door at all. I already had all the lights off, so maybe whoever was out there wouldn't know I was home. I had the remote control on the couch, and I quickly clicked the kill button to kill the light from the television. I hid under the blanket, just in case the guy looked in through the window. When I didn't answer, whoever was outside knocked again. He waited for a few moments. I still didn't answer the second time. When I still didn't respond, the person outside began banging really hard on the door, then started yelling, "I know you're home, and I know you're alone." He kept knocking on the door over and over. You might be wondering, why didn't I call the cops in that moment? Well, remember just how far away I lived. There was no way they would get there in time. I didn't even think about going to get my dad's gun either. I just stayed under those covers, shivering as the man continued pounding on the door. There was no way in hell I was going to answer it, obviously. Eventually, the guy gave up. I heard him knocking some things over on the porch. Then it was all quiet once more. I stayed on the couch covered up and didn't dare turn the television back on either. I mean, I didn't know if the man had gone to another door or window of the house just to hide. I didn't know if he could see inside. If I moved, maybe he would see me. Eventually, after quite a long time had passed, I fell asleep out of exhaustion. I woke up in the morning as the sun began to shine into the room. I felt very relieved a few hours later when the phone started ringing. I was scared to answer it, assuming it would be the same guy again. I had put 2 and 2 together at this point and figured that person must have been the knocker. To my fortune, though, the person on the phone was not that man. I answered it and was immediately informed it was the police. An old grandmother who lived a few miles down the road in a lonely house like my own had been attacked and brutally beaten the previous night. It happened only a few hours after the knocker had left my house. They were calling to warn us that whoever did the attacking was still at large and to exercise extreme caution. I just know it was that same man. Now, first off, I'm a guy. I have to get that out of the way right away, because this is a story about pet cats, and I know a lot of people assume cats are more of a girl's pet sort of thing. I've always had a great fondness for felines. I mean, they're such beautiful animals. Sure, some of them can act really stuck up sometimes, but hey, they're cats. They have every right to do so. My parents bought me a cat when I was about 10 years old. His name was Greasy, for no better reason than I wanted to name my cat something I was sure no one else would have already done. He's still alive, actually, and is sitting next to me as I'm writing this story down. Even though I love my cat, I wanted another one as well. Cats are sort of like tattoos, in the way that you can't only have just one of them. My parents, on the other hand, didn't want me to have more than one pet. I recall around the time I was 12 or 13. One night, Greasy was getting a little more meowy than usual. He was also hanging around the front door. When I went to check out why, I noticed there was a young cat hanging out in the bush in front of our house. Having sympathy for the young creature, as well as just loving young animals in general, because he was a freaking cat especially, I decided I'd feed him a bit. I grabbed one of Greasy's extra bowls and gave the extremely hungry cat outside a small meal. The way I looked at it now was that I now had 2 cats. I named this stray cat Sebastian and even wrote the name on his bowl. I wasn't allowed to bring him into the house, obviously, and I didn't tell my parents much about him. I enjoyed my stray cat though. He was awesome, and it was nice having one cat inside and one outside. My parents went to bed early because they often got up early for work. It was really easy to do this without them finding out because of that. I'm not really sure for how long this went on, but I guess it went on for a fairly long time. My parents didn't notice how quickly we were going through cat food, or perhaps they didn't care anyway. I always wished I could let Sebastian into the house, but of course I couldn't do so. Every now and then, Sebastian would eat his food early, then jump up on the window ledge and look inside. Whenever he'd do this, I'd pet him for a while. One night, I was watching some late-night television in the dark when I heard some rustling going on outside near the front door. I figured it was Sebastian looking for his dinner, so I grabbed his bowl and filled it up. When I went outside, however, he was nowhere to be seen. I tried calling out for him in a quiet voice, but he still didn't show up. I guess I stupidly figured he might be hanging out in the bushes. That was silly, simply because there was no reason for him to do that. He would always run towards me for the food. I walked over to the side of the house and nearly fell over in shock when I saw a figure dressed all in black sneaking underneath one of our windows. Shocked, I dropped the food. The man looked over to me. It only took a few moments for our mutual shock to fade and for him to immediately make a rush towards me. Having already dropped the cat food, I twisted around and quickly ran back to the house, screaming for my dad. I got to the door, opened it, and ran inside. I attempted to close it, but the guy shoved his arm in first. He grabbed the door and began trying to pull it open. We struggled back and forth for a moment, until suddenly the living room light turned on. When the light turned on, the would-be burglar realized he would be caught. He cut his losses and let go of the door. He jumped off the porch and ran for the hills, so to speak. My dad did call the cops. And to my surprise, the guy was actually caught as well. Sebastian did come back later to get his food too, although I was scared to go outside again. Still though, I put out his meal, and he was a very happy cat that night. Well, telling this story is going to date me a bit, I guess, but this happened when I was about 15 years old. I had been having a pretty severe case of insomnia, and as anyone who has suffered from insomnia knows, you can only lay in bed for so long before you just have to give up and find something to do. To let you know a little bit more about the situation, this happened in the summer. My parents were not home this night, as they had gone to a party. Knowing my father, he had probably gotten so drunk as well that they weren't going to be coming home anytime soon. He was one of those guys to get trashed, then refused to know when it was time to leave. Because of this, I was home all alone. I had actually started to drift off a bit when my body jerked. I'm sure you've had this happen before. It woke me up, and after that I wasn't able to get back to sleep. I tossed and turned and tossed and turned. Finally, I rolled over and looked at my clock. It was just a couple of minutes before 11:30 p.m. I figured I might as well get up for a bit and watch The Tonight Show. Maybe Johnny Carson would help me relax and put me to sleep. I walked up the hallway and into the living room without turning on any of the lights. I turned the TV on, then flopped down on the couch and stretched out a bit. I watched Johnny and began to feel a whole lot better after the beginning of the show. I went to turn the TV off and apparently got a bit of a static shock. This caused me to pull my hand away from the TV. Because of the suddenness of this action, I turned around, only to see, facing the couch, to my horror, a man hiding on the far side, crouched down in the small space between the wall and the couch. I screamed in shock. The man actually looked pretty surprised himself as well. I quickly sprinted out of the room and into the kitchen. My intent was to grab a knife. I found a big cleaver easily. I flipped the lights on and ran back into the living room to confront the man. The door was wide open, and the man had fled into the night. I called the cops as I did a thorough check of the house with cleaver in hand. The man was definitely gone now. All I could figure is he must have seen my parents' car gone, and the lights were out. He must have thought no one was home and tried to rob us. When he heard me get up, he didn't have time to get out of the house, so he hid in the corner. I don't think he expected me to stay up from insomnia and watch a whole hour of television. The man had been trapped there the entire time I was watching Johnny Carson. The man was right behind me, crouched in my house only a few feet away, and I never knew. I would have never known if I hadn't turned around from that sudden static shock. This was a few years ago. It was pretty late out, past 1:30 or 2 a.m. I believe. I was living with this boy who was pretty abusive, and he had gotten really jealous at this party we were at earlier that night. Not even an hour after we'd gotten home, he tossed me out onto our front porch and locked the door behind me. I was knocking and pleading for him to please let me back inside. I was still wearing what I'd worn to the party, and it was freezing out that night. I wasn't sure what to do. He had my phone, my purse, and my wallet in the house with him, so all I could do was sit on the porch crying. When he turned off the lights both outside and inside, I knew he was not going to let me back in. I felt so helpless and cold. I thought about knocking on a neighbor's door, but I had anxiety about waking any of them up and causing trouble for my boyfriend. Instead, I decided I would try to walk to this gas station and motel less than a mile away, so I could use their phone to try and call a girlfriend of mine and see if I could sleep over with her instead. Ironically enough, the road I was walking on, Donner Pass Road, was so freezing cold that it was fitting. But anyway, a little bit into the walk, this tall white pickup truck was approaching on the opposite side of the road I was on. I tried not to make eye contact for obvious reasons, but then I heard the truck stop and begin to make a U-turn. My heart began to pound fiercely. I froze up and forced myself to speed walk at the very least. The truck pulled up to me, and this guy rolled down his window and asked what I was doing out this late at night. I told him how I was going to meet my friend at the gas station, and she was expecting me quite soon. He smiled and offered me a ride. I said no thank you, citing that I didn't like to hitchhike. Well, that's good. I don't pick up hitchhikers or anyone. You don't look like a hitchhiker, though. You just look like someone who needs some help. He kept on driving next to me and told me I shouldn't think he was a creep. He pulled out what looked to be a police badge and told me he had just gotten off duty, which is why he was in civilian clothes and out so late. He said he wouldn't mind driving next to me, just to make sure I got to where I was headed to safely. I was very naive and a bit too trusting of his kindness and credentials. When he offered me a ride again, I said it would be nice because the gas station wasn't that far anyway. He popped the door open and I hopped in. The radio was down low. It was a little bit messy inside. The ashtray was full of cigarettes, and there were tons of newspapers lining the passenger floor. I was moving my feet when some of the papers shifted, showing a pair of handcuffs, some coffee cups, empty water bottles, rags, a highlight-colored bandana, and some various other garbage. He apologized, saying it was a truck he took out hunting, but it was super warm, so I was happy for that. And I didn't mind the mess at all. He told me his name was John. He asked why I was so scantily dressed without a jacket. I started to tell him about the party and the fight I'd been in with my boyfriend. He was super charming and attentive. He even joked that he could go back and arrest my boyfriend right now if I wanted. I asked him about himself, and he told me about his family. He was a young dad, had a wife, daughter, a son, a dog. I told him it sounded like he had the perfect little family. He laughed and said he certainly did. It sort of clicked for me to ask him if I could use his phone, but he said no because he had to save up his battery as it was about to die. We were approaching the gas station when all of a sudden he just drove right past it. "Oh, I think that's the one, you just missed it." But he didn't answer me. I felt sick to my stomach. My heart began to pound. I started getting choked up, and my eyes started tearing up as I looked out the windows. I watched the lights behind us getting further and further away. It was hard for me to even speak, but somehow I murmured out, asking if he could please turn around. Instead, he ignored me. As I looked over to him, he just looked empty-eyed and emotionless, totally dead and glazed over. I looked back out the window and down the road to see if maybe we were going slow enough that I could make a leap out of the car without seriously injuring myself. I remembered always hearing never go to the second location. I thought about the possibility of jumping out and breaking an ankle and how it would be so much harder to get away with only one foot as opposed to two. I was debating with myself. Sure, there was snow on the ground, but then again, snow can be hard, especially when you're not fully clothed. I felt so dumb. I wasn't even tied up or anything, but I still couldn't do anything. There was nothing but trees and empty road and us two. I was crying pretty badly at this point and asked him to please borrow his phone. He told me to shut up and stop talking. He then started talking under his breath. "Girls shouldn't be out so late, you know. You shouldn't have been out alone. Look what you're doing to me, dressed up like a slut." He kept saying these terrible things to me. I wasn't even responding. I was just crying, trying to think past the fear I was feeling. I remembered the pair of handcuffs underneath my feet, so I used a little scooping motion to try and pick them up. I used it to push them under the bottom of my seat as far as I could. I was thinking of different ways I could try and help myself. If we were close enough to some upcoming lights or structures, perhaps, maybe I could grab the wheel and cause us to crash into them. Maybe I could get the attention of a cop passing by or something, swerve and grab the wheel so he would appear to be a drunk driver and pull us over. I even had the thought that maybe this man was just having a weird night. I didn't want to do anything to hurt him, but I told myself that sort of thinking got me into this mess in the first place. He pulled off the road where there were still woods on both sides of us. On his side, the wooded trees were closer to the road. On mine, there was a small gap fully covered in thick snow, just before the tree line. He turned off the car and coldly said there was something wrong with the engine and to get out right now. He grabbed the keys and was stepping out of the car. I grabbed onto the center console and cried and pleaded for him to not make me get out with him because it was too cold with what I had on. He turned to face me, door still open, and shouted at me to get out right now. I dug my fingernails deeper into the console. I was crying. "Please, John, I'm so cold and scared." I was thinking of everything I'd ever heard. Humanize yourself. Use first names. He stared at me in this way I can't even begin to describe. I wouldn't even know how to start. He climbed back in the car. I slinked back toward my window, scared he would simply drag me out by force. He turned off the headlights, and everything went dark. He stared at the steering wheel for what felt like years. He lit up a cigarette and looked out his window, then back at me. He could hear the newspaper shuffling on the ground as I was adjusting my legs, but while still staring out his window, he asked me if I thought about running. He told me if I did, he had a quick way to get me exactly where he wanted me. Oddly enough, I had been thinking of running just minutes before that, but reasoned that if he wanted me out of the car, I should definitely stay inside. Otherwise, he'd simply chase me or shoot me. I think at that point, I finally hit the reserve of my courage, and instead of panic, there was simply numbness and exhaustion. There was still an occasional tear or two, but I just went completely numb. It was dead quiet. But finally, I just barely audibly told him that my friend was still waiting for me. I asked about his wife and children. He very plainly told me he didn't have either, and that his house was simply empty. I asked him what he was thinking about. "I'm thinking about what to do with you." He didn't say it angrily, though. He just said it coldly, which sort of scared me more. I started getting worked back up and crying. At that point, he told me not to cry anymore and turned the car on, offering me some heat. I told him all I wanted to do was go home. Eventually, he started driving. He kept driving until we approached a gas station. I was gauging the right time to reach for the wheel, but before I could, he slowed down. While pulling up to the station, He told me not to tell anyone or he would come back for me. Then he told me all he was doing was teaching me a lesson to not hitchhike with strangers. He almost came to a complete stop when he told me to get out before he changed his mind. Before he could even get another look at me to assess my understanding, I had already thrown myself out of the truck and was sprinting toward the gas station. The panic was overwhelming me, but I stopped and remembered to try and see his license plate at the very least. I turned around and only caught the blur of the last 3 numbers as he was driving off. I ran inside and asked the clerk behind the counter to call the police. I waited until the officer got there, and I'll be honest, I was a little bit scared I would see John once more. My fears melted away though when the new-faced policeman arrived. I gave him the description of John, his appearance, the vehicle color and type, the parts of the license plate number I'd caught, and the fact he said he was an off-duty cop. Basically, any information I could. I asked him if he could look at the camera. The officer disappeared in the back for a little bit, then came back out saying there was nothing on them. I asked if I would be able to look as well. The officer said no, and asked if I didn't trust him. He then gave me a ride to my friends, lecturing me for hitchhiking. This mostly consisted of him asking if I knew who Ted Bundy was. He told me I was naive to think it could never happen to me. I never heard anything back about the report I'd made. I would try to follow up, but each time I did, they would simply ignore me. All aside from a single time, when they told me my case number didn't even exist. All that didn't stop me from trying to follow up though. Throughout the months and years, I asked my friend whose home I slept over at that one night if she'd ever heard of any weird things or anything like that since that incident happened. If anyone up there had ever said anything about it. She always said no though. I sort of let it go and tried to tell myself that maybe he actually was just trying to teach me a lesson or something. I mean, I definitely never hitchhiked again, so if it was a lesson, it certainly worked. I never heard anything back having to do with the case. I never heard any other odd experiences up there, so maybe it was just one man trying to teach me something. Sometimes, though, I think I tell myself all of that to help me sleep better at night. It was all so real. Even if it wasn't real, though, I'm glad I didn't get out of that car into the woods that night. I have kind of a weird story to tell. I've only ever told one person, as honestly, I didn't realize how strange the entire situation was until I brought this up to a friend of mine. This happened a few months ago, and at the time, I had just recently been fired from my job. I had been working there for several years, and so the abrupt firing caught me by surprise. I thought everything had been going all right for me, but just like that, they told me to pack up my things and leave right away. Honestly, it made me feel pretty bad. Rather than spend some time trying to find another job immediately, I spent a few weeks moping around my house and not doing much of anything. I had lost both the strength and the will to do anything, especially look for a new job. Though at that dark point in my life, one of my close friends tried to help me out. This friend reached out, telling me that a position at one of her other friends' companies had opened up recently. It was nearly the same as the one I'd been fired from, so right away it seemed I'd hit the jackpot. All seemed perfect, though there was still something in my mind saying this was a little bit strange. My friend, who I won't name for privacy's sake, had always been a little bit on the shady side. Maybe they just weren't the most open person to talk to, or maybe they were just simply reserved, but there always seemed to be something a little bit off about them. For the sake of my future, as well as a potential job opportunity though, I put that out of my mind and focused on applying. In just a short time, I'd gotten out of my slump pretty fast, and was preparing for this new job and a new start as well. My friend sent me the phone number of the company, and told me the hours I would be able to call them at. I woke up as early as possible on the day I was going to give them a call, readying myself for the always nerve-wracking interview I was about to have. When the time was right, I called the company, and before I knew it, I was connected to your average phone-answering secretary, it seemed. The fake peppy voice she put on made me feel that I'd had the right number straight away, and I told her the reason I was calling. She was quick to begin asking questions afterward, taking in all my basic information. Name, phone number, just like every other company did as standard procedure. I replied with all the information she was seeking, along with answering a few more filtering personal questions she asked, like what experience I had and any prior jobs I'd had as well. I sat on the call for some time answering her questions before she said she'd gotten all the information she needed out of me. At the end of the call, she informed me that 2 days from then I could come in for an in-person interview. I remember hanging up the phone and sitting still for a few moments after. I was as happy as I could be. After going through such a tough time unexpectedly, it felt like I was really getting somewhere. It was easy to say I was ecstatic about getting an interview. Thus, I spent the next few days preparing before the day was finally here. I woke up early, got dressed in my finest. A black suit over a button-up shirt underneath, along with a pair of fine dress pants. I went the full 9 yards with everything that morning, as I knew I had to be my best for any interview. I pepped myself up the entire time as well, until I was finally ready to leave. Still though, I was really nervous. I took a few deep breaths before leaving the house. I got into my car and started heading to the address. I remember the drive actually wasn't too far away, only about 10 minutes or so. As I got closer though, it began to feel as if my destination was hours away. I got closer to the address, and my nerves got even worse. I had been through many interviews before, and the thought of one more shouldn't have made me as nervous as I was. It got the best of me during the car drive, and I was completely caught up in them. Before I even realized I'd pulled right into a parking space of where my GPS had told me to go. As I parked, I came to my senses and realized where I was. I managed to get even more nervous as I realized this. I wanted to go home and forget about this interview, as I thought about how unexpectedly my last job had ended. Still though, I shook him off and looked at where my GPS had taken me. I stepped out and looked at the building in front of me. Instead of what I assumed was going to be a typical office space or something, there was a gigantic run-down building in front of me. I remember staring at every inch for some time. All the windows were either broken or boarded up completely. The coloring of the bricks was faded as well, and there wasn't even a front door on the place. I began to think that I simply had the wrong address, but my GPS confirmed this seemed to be the correct destination. I even checked the address I'd typed in multiple times. Each time I looked, the numbers were the same and correct. I realized that this really seemed to be the right place. My mind was all over the place in this moment. My nerves about the interview were gone, although in their place was a whole new set of anxiousness. I went closer to the building to inspect it. I had to see for myself that the building was the right one before I decided to leave. As I approached, I was stopped by someone coming out from the side of the building, a man in a reflective high-visibility jacket. "Hey, what are you doing here? This is a construction zone," the man yelled. I was even more confused. I understood what he meant though when I walked closer to him and caught a peek around the other side. There was indeed a construction crew with tons of heavy machinery just sitting there. "Oh, sorry, I thought this was the place for my interview. I was looking for so-and-so, but it seems I have the wrong place." No, this is so-and-so, but I don't know what interview you're going to be having here. The building's been abandoned for a few decades," the man said. My face turned to shock, and I got even more of a headache from the situation. "But I called a few days ago. Someone answered and said she was with a company called so-and-so." The man stared at me. "I don't know who's trying to fool you here, but this building did belong to that company back in the day. They haven't been around for a few decades, though. Now get along there. The building's supposed to be demolished today, and my guys have to get back to work," the man said again. I could do nothing but leave. The company seemingly didn't exist anymore. It seemed like I'd been the victim of some sort of cruel prank at the hand of whoever was on the other line. But something put me off. The call had seemed so legitimate. The girl on the other line had certainly fooled me for being a secretary of some company. I didn't think much more of it, though. The man had said the company I was trying to join hadn't existed in that place in decades. Just like that, I was back to square one. No job and no interview. The drive back home was long and silent. It hardly even fazed me just how weird the encounter had been, as all I could think about was now I wasn't even able to have that much to be excited about. I got home and went right back to where I'd started. I holed up in my house for a couple of weeks, not having the motivation to do anything, as I once again found myself in a depressive episode. As more time went by, I slowly healed again, and found the will to look for a job once more. This was several months ago, mind you, and since then I fixed myself even more. I was able to find a new job, much better for my own health than the one I'd been fired from. Over the several months in between this story I just told and now, I'd been so focused on my new job and working hard enough to keep it, that the situation had gone through and slipped my mind entirely. It wasn't up until the point that I told my friend the entire story of what happened to me that I realized just how strange it was. When I informed my friend the number they had given me, I realized it was actually incorrect from the one she'd meant to give me. She apologized a lot after realizing her mistake and ended up giving me the actual phone number, which is actually how I found my current job. The fact of what I had gone through was still up for question. I had accidentally been given a wrong number, but was put through to a seemingly real company. On top of that, I even got told to come in for an interview to a real address, and for a real company that once existed, even if it no longer did. The whole situation is just kind of a big mystery to me. My friend and I threw out many ideas, some that were pretty ordinary like a simple prank call, and some that were farther out. You know, some like how I could have gone through an insane phenomenon like time travel through a phone call or something. Some of the ideas were of course ridiculous, and even now I have no clue what happened to me on that day. I had a really scary experience when I was a little girl, around the age of 8 years old. This might be a little intense, so please be warned about that ahead of time. An aunt of mine had her house burned down, and very unfortunately, she also died in the fire. However, the firemen were able to save my 6-year-old cousin. Of course, she experienced something that would disturb her for the rest of her life. My aunt had been a single mother. She hadn't seen or heard from the father in years, so he wasn't able to take custody of his daughter. For a while, she came to live with us. My mom thought that if she was with a girl of her age, it would help her get better. It was really hard living with her and trying to get her to do anything. I used to love tea parties and would hold them often. I couldn't really get her to take part in them at all, though. She would just, understandably, sit there silently and look sad. She rarely talked, and the only time she once did was to say, "That cup is empty," as if she didn't know we were supposed to just be playing. The girl slept in the same room as me, as I had 2 twin beds in the room. It was fine, and for the most part, she seemed to sleep well. Occasionally, though, she would have very bad nightmares and would wake up in the middle of the night screaming. My mom would always come to the room and grab her, hug her tight, and try to make her feel better. I have to admit, I didn't like having her around. At only 8 years old, I guess I couldn't really appreciate what she was going through. I feel really bad about that now, especially since I've never had to lose my mom. But something about her creeped me out. She was always so quiet, only communicating with people mostly with nods and shakes of the head. She would occasionally walk into the room and look around at everyone without coming in, and sit down in place. Then, after a while, she would turn around and leave without a word. It was kind of creepy. One time, my mom took us for a walk. We lived in a 2nd-story apartment. When we left the apartment, she stopped and looked at the window to it. I tried to get her to keep walking, but she didn't want to. My mom didn't notice at first, and didn't notice when I asked the girl what she was looking at. In a very rare moment of her actually talking, she told me, "Mommy is in the window." Of course, that chilled me, and I didn't want much to do with her. When my mom came over and told us to keep up, she went ahead and started walking alongside my mom. As I looked up at the window, though, I thought I saw a woman standing behind the sheer curtain. I felt my heart jump in my chest. I ran forward and grabbed my mother's hand. After that, I began to get a little bit scared of that house. I normally didn't, but that experience was enough to be pretty terrifying. The scariest thing, though, happened at night, and if I recall, it was about a week after what we saw in the window that day. My cousin and I were pretty soundly sleeping when I heard some sort of creaking noise that woke me up from my sleep. I looked over at my cousin's bed, only to notice that she was sitting up in it. She was rocking back and forth, and that was what was making the creaking sound. She was just doing it over and over again. I called out to her, trying to get her attention. However, she wouldn't respond to me in any way. She just kept rocking back and forth, staring at a certain area. I turned and looked to where she was looking at, only to realize that it was the bedroom closet door, and the door was wide open. We always kept the door closed when we were sleeping. I asked my cousin if she saw her mom in the closet again, remembering what she'd told me about last week. At first, she didn't respond, but when I asked her again, she turned and looked at me. "That's not my mommy in the closet," she told me. I looked back to the closet and saw the shadow of a person standing inside. I screamed for my mom at the top of my lungs. My mom rushed into the room and immediately turned on the lights. She saw that both of us girls were terrified and asked what was going on. I told her someone was hiding in our bedroom closet. My mom went in and searched, but somehow she didn't find anything. Both of us assured her that we'd really seen it though. My mom took us both into her room and let us sleep with her that night. Although we didn't sleep great, it was the only way either of us could have gotten any sleep at all. My cousin stayed with us for about another 3 months. After that, a paternal aunt asked my mom if she could take custody of the young girl. My mom was okay with that, mostly because the aunt was very wealthy and she thought she could provide a better life for her. I didn't see that cousin ever again. After she left, I didn't see any figures in the window either, or in that closet ever again. I went back to sleeping comfortably in my own room. I'm a 21-year-old guy, and I've been in a relationship with my 21-year-old girlfriend Lisa for a couple of years now. Safe to say, we've both gotten pretty comfortable with each other, which meant we went out to eat a lot and skipped the gym somewhat. Within the past year, we didn't gain much weight, but we both did lose a lot of muscle. And at the time of this incident, we both decided we wanted to get back into the gym and have a healthier lifestyle together. We figured we could make it something like our New Year's resolution. I never really did resolutions in the new year, but my girlfriend was very adamant, and I'd do whatever it took to make her happy. She had started getting really serious about this, making meal plans, doing research for different workouts we could do together. I thought it was really great we were going to do this. I was super optimistic about it, and the last thing I would have thought would happen to us, well, it did happen. When January 1st rolled around, we spent the day researching different gyms near us and the classes they offered to try and narrow down which one we wanted to try out. It was a little bit difficult because we both wanted very specific things and not all were offered at the same gym. Me being the kind of guy that will always try to please his girlfriend though, I just told her we could go to the one that offered what she wanted and I'd be willing to try something new. It was actually just around the corner from our house. We lived there for a few years, and within that time, we'd had no issues. We actually ended up liking it a lot. On January 2nd, we went to that gym and signed up for their 3-month plan. We didn't want to risk signing up for a year if we didn't like it. That day, we did a short workout together to kind of get us into the swing of things and get familiar with all the equipment. It went pretty great. The next few days, we did some classes and got to know the different instructors and even started making a few new friends. It was turning out to be exactly what we needed. Fast forward a couple of weeks. We had gone down to the gym like we always did, only this time we decided to go on a Friday, which was quite unusual for us. Lisa usually worked Fridays, and I didn't like to go without her, so I stayed home. This week she had the Friday off though, so we happened to have time to go. We didn't realize, but Fridays are their weightlifting class days. When we walked in there were all these huge bodybuilder type guys strutting around the gym. Lisa and I both commented to each other that it made us feel a little out of place. Nevertheless, we started our own workout for the day and tried to ignore these huge muscle men all around us. I'd say about 30 minutes into our workout, I noticed one of the bigger guys staring at Lisa, and I mean just unashamedly staring right at her. He even looked at me noticing and smirked, like he knew I could see what he was doing, but he didn't seem to care. That's when he walked right up to us. He walked right past me and stood in front of Lisa. "Hey honey, want a real man to show you how to tighten up that little body of yours?" Lisa looked at me. Of course, she was uncomfortable by this comment. I was worried for both of us at this point. Clearly, this guy didn't respect anybody, and he was quite huge. If he tried to fight me, he could probably pop my head like a grape. Dude, she's with me. Can you leave us alone?" I tried to talk as calmly as I could, but I knew I came off as more nervous than anything. "Hey, would you let the lady speak? I think I know what she wants." He didn't even look at me when he said that. He just stared down at Lisa. When I looked back toward her, she was now staring directly at me, with water beginning to pool in her eyes. Lisa was not one for confrontation. She really didn't like attention at all. I tried one more time to get this guy to leave us alone. I grabbed Lisa by the arm and lifted her off the yoga mat she was sitting on. We took steps away from the man, and in the most serious tone I could muster, I said, "Leave us alone already. She isn't interested. You're being hella rude, dude. Just go back to discussing doping with your buddies or something. Clearly, that's what you're really interested in." Now, I will say that probably wasn't the smartest thing to say to a man clearly abusing steroids. I should have known making him angry would cause a further problem. His testosterone levels must be through the roof for him to do what he did. He started walking away, and I thought that would be the end of it. I turned towards Lisa and told her we should get going and would come back another day. Only she didn't answer me. Her eyes went wide, and she told me to look out. Next thing I knew, a dumbbell came flying right past my head and shattered the mirror in front of me. I turned around quickly and saw the same guy picking up another dumbbell to hit me with, getting ready to throw it, before his friends all tackled him. Lisa and I quickly picked up our things and ran towards the office to tell the manager what had happened and have them phone the police. When the police got there, they arrested the man, who was subsequently banned from the gym. We decided to press charges, but were informed we probably wouldn't hear anything about the case for a couple of weeks while it was being processed. And they were right. For the next couple of weeks, we heard nothing about the man. We did ask the police department, though, to let us know if he was released. We didn't really think he was going to do anything, having calmed down since, but we still wanted to be as cautious as possible just in case. Lo and behold, 3 weeks after the incident, we got a call that he was out, and it freaked us out a little. We figured we would never run into him again, though. Where we lived was a big city, and we didn't really go out much anyways. We continued going to the gym as usual, and nothing like that happened again. We were beginning to feel comfortable once more, or so I thought. A few days passed since the man had been let out, and we had just gone to bed for the night. We were meticulous about closing all our doors and windows and locking everything up. We were actually both pretty paranoid about someone breaking in, since our neighbors had been robbed a few months back. Around 2 a.m., I was woken up by Lisa frantically shaking me, telling me someone was in the house. There's not many things that can make you wake up that fast, but that's definitely one of them. I leaped out of bed and grabbed the bat I kept underneath. I walked toward the bedroom door and opened it just a crack to see out. Man, let me tell you, I was absolutely shocked to see, you guessed it, roid head standing in my living room. I shut the door while making as little noise as I could and locked it up. I whispered to Lisa to call the police and tell them someone was in our home. She started freaking out on me, and I had to try to calm her down so he wouldn't hear us. I opened the window that led from our bedroom into the side yard and instructed Lisa to climb outside. After she did, I got out next and made sure to close the window behind us, just in case he managed to get into the bedroom. I didn't want him to know where we'd gone. Lisa called the police and told them what was going on, and they told us to go to a neighbor's house and wait for officers to arrive. Just as we opened the side gate to exit the backyard, I heard a loud crash coming from inside. When we looked back to the bedroom, the man had barreled his way through the door and into the room and started searching for us. Lisa and I rushed out of the yard and banged on our neighbor's door till they let us in. The police were there in 15 minutes, and we watched through our neighbor's window as they escorted the man out of our house in handcuffs. They ended up telling us they found rope, duct tape, and zip ties in the back of his car, along with a gun and a couple of knives. He eventually confessed that he found our names from us pressing charges against him, since that's public record or something, I guess. Knowing our names made it easy for him to find our address online. The police obviously had enough evidence to charge him with home invasion and attempted abduction. His bail was set so high he couldn't possibly afford it, which we really appreciated. He got 5 years in prison, which to us seemed pretty fair, I guess. We moved out of that house and into a different one closer to Lisa's parents, just to be sure he wouldn't be able to find us whenever he did end up getting out of prison. He never really said why he broke into our home or what he was going to do to us that night, but good God, am I glad I never had to find out. I used to work at a 7-Eleven here in the United States, and the scariest thing that ever happened to me there was also the single most terrifying thing that's ever happened in my entire life. It happened on a particularly quiet night. I was still kind of hungover from going out drinking the night before, and because of that, I wasn't even really paying attention when this one guy entered the store. I heard the door sliding open. I vaguely heard his footsteps as he walked up to the counter, and then, right as I was about to lift my head up and ask the man what he wanted, he slammed something down on the counter in front of me. I remember the very first thing I noticed being the sudden red splatter on my t-shirt, which was plain white. The moment his hand impacted the counter, all these little red specks appeared on my shirt. I already recoiled from the shock of having his hand slammed down in front of me, but when I saw what he'd just slammed down next to the register, I recoiled even further. It was a tongue, like an actual tongue. Even though it was soaked in blood, I could recognize the deep ridge running down the middle of it. It sounds like such a cliche when I think about it now, but now I understand what people mean when they say they were frozen in fear. The whole thing was an assault on my senses. I think it just short-circuited my fight-or-flight mechanism to the point where I couldn't figure out what to do. The look in the guy's eyes as he stared at me was so calm but intense. His eyes were so wide and unblinking, it was like he didn't have eyelids at all. It was only when he spoke that I actually found the will to move. All he said to me was, "Call 911. I bolted into the back office, locked the door behind me, and immediately called the cops. All the while, I watched the guy on the cameras, just standing there at the register. He didn't move at all. He seemed to be looking down, staring at the mess he'd just left on my counter. Given the gruesome nature of my emergency, there was a police patrol car and 2 cops pulling up outside in just a matter of moments. The guy didn't put up any kind of fight when they moved to arrest him. He just held his wrists and allowed them to put the handcuffs on him, then let the cops take him away. Once he was safely out of the store, I walked out of the office, trying not to look at what was still on the counter. Then I told the cops everything that happened. Obviously, it wasn't all that much, but as I was talking to them, I noticed more and more police surrounding a car in the parking lot that still had the door open. I called the store manager for the McDonald's across the street, telling them the cops had to close the store because it was an active crime scene. They rushed down to see me and find out what was going on, even though it was their day off. After telling them what happened, I went home to decompress. From what I heard after, the guy had gotten into an argument with his wife while driving somewhere. At some point, he just kinda snapped, pulled up into a parking lot, stabbed her to death, and then cut her tongue out. For some reason, he picked our 7-Eleven to walk into to slam the tongue he just cut out of her mouth down onto our countertop. As you might imagine, I was allowed to take a little bit of time off of work after that whole thing, as I just couldn't face going back there so soon. Even when I did go back, I was on edge the whole time for my first couple of shifts. I just couldn't seem to shake the image of that bloody tongue lying on the countertop in front of me. The thing I can't seem to shake either is that it wasn't enough for the guy to just stab and kill his own wife. He had to reach into her mouth afterwards and cut out her tongue. How completely insane with fury does someone have to be to do something like that? Like, what could possibly possess someone to do something so horrifying to someone they love? The guy didn't look like a monster either. He didn't look evil or deranged. All that gave away his distressed mental state was that crazy look in his eyes, the one that had frozen me in fear. It just haunts me, seeing seemingly normal people are capable of things like that. I used to work at a 7-Eleven that was right next to an art school campus. In addition to all the snacks and drinks, we had a little stationery section and kept some stuff behind the counter too. One of the things we kept behind the counter were scissors, the kind that are sealed in a plastic casing. So one day, this customer walks up to the counter with a Gatorade, and asks if he can have a pair of scissors too. Of course, I grabbed a pair for him. I scanned them and told him the price of both of his items. Instead of getting his wallet out though, he immediately started removing the plastic packaging from the scissors. I didn't think it too suspicious at first. I figured he needed them for some kind of minor emergency or something, and that he'd pay for them after cutting whatever it was that needed to be cut. Instead, once they were out of the packaging, he gripped the handle like they were a knife or something and looked me right in the eyes. I could just kill you with these right now, you know that? I was so stunned I didn't know what to say. I know he must have enjoyed the fearful look on my face because of the way he started smiling. All I could do was reach for my phone in my pocket and start to dial 911. I had no real way of defending myself, and I was hoping the cops would arrive before he actually killed me. Just as I tapped the numbers out, I looked up to see him walking away from the counter, laughing to himself as he walked out of the store. I stayed on the line with 911 for a while, shaking as I told them what just happened. When the cops showed up a little while later, and they took their time since it wasn't an ongoing situation, an officer reviewed the security camera footage. It turns out the guy had been doing the same thing all over town, picking out girls working retail on their own before shoplifting random items like that. He had the same MMO every single time too. He would always get away with it by telling the girl he could kill them with whatever he was stealing. Be it a knife or scissors or hedge clippers, he never actually hurt someone yet. But the cops were extra focused on getting him in cuffs because it felt like it was only a matter of time before he actually crossed the line and did hurt someone. Even though he took his time to show up, the cop was really helpful and reassuring. He gave me his cell number to call him directly the next time the man walked into the store. It must have been pretty serious because the guy actually had a real detective assigned to his case. Although I didn't hear about it afterwards, I sincerely hope the guy never crossed that line and actually hurt a girl with any of the items he ended up stealing. More than a decade ago, on one of the hottest days of the year, I was taking my kids down to the 7-Eleven near our apartment block to grab some big gulps. Just as we were walking past a public park right near a tree line, this completely normal, well-dressed looking couple emerged from the trees and started walking right towards us. I actually couldn't believe it when the guy suddenly told him to give him my wallet and anything else in my pockets. I really thought it was like a dumb joke of some kind. They looked so well-dressed they should have been in the office working or something. I actually let out this nervous laughter, then asked if they were serious. The guy answered my question by pulling out what looked like a fishing knife from his jacket pocket. When he opened it and pointed it at me, I shoved my daughter behind me to protect her as best I could. Then, just as I was going to do the same for my son, the the woman grabbed his other arm and began pulling him towards her. I honestly felt like my heart was about to explode with fear. There's no other way of describing it. I suddenly just lost all sense of self-preservation as I leapt forward to attack this well-to-do looking woman who just grabbed my boy. The next thing I knew, I felt what I could only describe as a cold punch under the ribs of my left side. I looked down to see the guy had buried his fishing knife in my stomach. What came next felt like a little bit of divine intervention, honestly. 2 joggers had spotted what was going on and came over to intervene. This scared off at least one of the unassuming muggers. As I turned to check on my kids, though, I felt my legs fall out from underneath me and I hit the ground hard. I remember hearing someone screaming and thinking it was my daughter. When I looked, the woman who had grabbed my son was on the ground though, crying and wailing with blood pouring from her mouth. Honestly, I didn't remember hitting her, but she seemed pretty adamant that I did. She was actually trying to make it out like she was the victim of the whole situation. Maybe trying to avoid getting arrested when the cops finally showed up. The police that patrolled that park showed up not long after. The cops actually started asking the woman what happened, like if we were a couple or something. My kids had to tell them that she was the partner of the guy that had stabbed me. This definitely threw the joggers off too, because they must have assumed that was the case as well. The whole time, I just kept begging someone to call the ambulance. I was pretty sure I was bleeding to death. I got taken to the hospital, and to my complete disbelief, I was questioned about the whole thing as though I was a suspect. I had no idea what this was about until a while after. It looked more and more likely I was going to be charged with battery for the woman, since it turned out she was actually from a decently well-off family and gotten into some vicious cycle of addiction with some trust fund junkie she'd met in the city. Her family actually tried to sue me when the charges didn't stick, but it was thrown out and she was sentenced for attempted kidnapping not long after. As for me, I had a tube in my chest for 2 weeks after surgery to remove the knife, but thankfully I made a full recovery. Honestly, when I look back on it, I'm just glad my kids didn't get hurt in any way, and I still run through all the horrific scenarios in my head where we didn't walk away from that situation relatively unscathed. I work at a 7-Eleven part-time in between classes. Earlier this year, we got a little rush of customers in the early afternoon one time. I served 2 guys for coffee and smokes, and at the back of the line, there was this tiny kid, no older than maybe 11 or 12, just waiting there patiently with a backpack in his hand. Honestly, I thought they looked kind of cute, like a little gentleman doing some grocery shopping for his mom or something. When he got to the front of the line, I asked him, "What can I help you with, sir?" in a kind of joking, playful way. Without a hint of emotion on his face, he reached into his backpack and suddenly pulled out a gun. "Give me all the money." When he pointed it at me, I wasn't sure if it was real or not. Where the hell would a 12-year-old kid get their hands on a loaded gun like that? It's not like the 7-Eleven I work at is in a high-crime area either. It's actually located in a pretty nice place, and although I've heard 1 or 2 stories from coworkers about some trouble at the store, nothing had ever happened like this. There was one other guy in the store at the time. I looked over at him to see him kind of smiling at the kid, smiling and frowning, like he was amused but disapproved of this kid playing a dumb childish prank. I don't know about guns, but I figured this guy must have, so I tried calling the kid's bluff. "You shouldn't point toys like that, sweetheart. Cops might think it's real or something." The kid then responded by cocking the gun. There was a real metallic sound that sent a shock of fear running through me. I knew no toy guns made that kind of sound. As if to illustrate he wasn't joking around, the kid pointed the gun in the air and fired a shot that went right past my head. After my ears got done ringing and I came to, I heard once again, "Give me all the money," in the same monotone, emotionless way. I didn't hesitate in doing what he asked. I put as much cash as I could onto the countertop, then watched him fill his backpack with it before he walked out of the store. I think the thing that scared me so much about this, though, was that the kid didn't seem to understand the gravity of the situation. He definitely seemed like he had something missing about him, like he didn't understand he could have actually killed someone over whatever dumb thing he wanted to buy with that money, be it video games or candy or whatever it was. At least a grown-up armed robber understands a gun is a means of getting what they want, and it's not a good idea to just fire it whenever, just in case they accidentally shoot someone in the face at the very least. I get the feeling, though, that if I'd even tried to resist or tell the kid no at all, he'd just shoot me in the face because it's what he assumed he should do. It's almost surreal to me now. The closest I'd ever come to death is at the hands of a small child, someone who should have been so innocent and carefree and full of love, but instead felt nothing. I had a guy come into the 7-Eleven I was working at, and when I was ringing up the items he wanted, he started getting all fresh with me, saying stuff like, "You're real pretty," and "What time do you finish work?" I lied to him and told him I was on till 11, even though I was finishing at 6, which was only about an hour away. He said he'd come back then, and we could go out for a beer or something. I advised him not to, since my boyfriend would be coming to pick me up around then, and he wouldn't like the idea of some random guy hitting on me. That didn't seem to bother this man too much, though, as he made some dumb comment about how he'd make my boyfriend see things his way or something. I just nodded and ignored him. I could see him getting kind of angry before he walked out of the store. It didn't bother me too much, though, as he was only going to come back to the store later to find out I wasn't even there. By that time, I'd be safe at home and away from this creepy pervert. At 6, when my shift finished, I walked outside with my purse, only to see a car door open about 20 or 30 feet away. I swear, I felt my stomach tie into knots when I saw that same man step outside. I did a straight 180-degree turn on my heels and started walking back into the store. I went right behind the counter, into the manager's office, after telling my coworker, "Just say I'm on break, okay?" He seemed real confused for a second, but as I shut the door and listened right at the edge of it, it was only 30 or so seconds at the most before I heard him say, "Oh, her? She's just on break. I'm sure she'll be on in a minute." Normally, I'd take the bus home, but that night I knew I'd have to get an Uber if I wanted to make it home at all without being seriously harmed. I called the Uber and waited for it to arrive. Then I tried to rush out as fast as I could. I didn't see the guy in the store anymore. I asked my coworker real quick as I was leaving, "Is that guy waiting for me?" He shook his head, still confused but now getting the gist of what was actually happening. They asked if I wanted them to call the cops, and shook my head, just gunning for my Uber. As I pushed open the glass door, I couldn't see the guy anywhere in the lot. I was so set on getting outside that I didn't look left or right as I walked out of the 7-Eleven. I had no warning because of this when the guy grabbed my arm from behind and jerked me backward. He looked really, really angry, and he growled at me. "You lied to me." He then called me a bunch of names as I tried pulling away from him. Luckily, my Uber driver saw absolutely everything. He jumped out of his car. "Hey, let her go right now or I'll call the cops." He did let me go. He smiled at the Uber driver as he told me, "This isn't over. I don't like being lied to." I wish that was just bluster, like he was trying to act hard to save a little face, but it was not. For the next 3 months, he made my life a living hell. He kept on waiting outside of the 7-Eleven to the point where I had to blow a ton of my wages on Ubers to and from work. Then there was the time he actually tried to follow me home. I had to tell the Uber driver what was happening so he could drive into the city just to shake the guy's tail. I tipped that guy massively, even though he initially refused to even accept payment for the ride. He insisted on canceling until I burst into tears and begged him to take the money and my tip. I couldn't make this someone else's problem. I couldn't have that on my mind, as well as all this other stuff. I actually developed something of a relationship with that one specific Uber driver. He became like a father figure to me, who always accepted my ride requests whenever he was working and made sure no one tried to follow me home. He was also the guy that told me I needed to get the cops involved. He thought this guy was really going to hurt me. He knew people with the same mentality, and they only ever gave up when the law got involved. I didn't even know why I was surprised when I found out the guy had a previous conviction for stalking. He seemed to know the legal process like the back of his hand. He knew the process of getting a restraining order through the courts could take weeks at minimum. He'd come visit me at the 7-Eleven just to taunt me sometimes, and only leave once I threatened to call the cops on him. That was just about the only thing that really seemed to get to him too. The fact that he'd been arrested and convicted over something like that before. I wanted to tell him that he was pathetic, that he'd never have a good normal woman all to himself. He'd always be some kind of deranged psycho who got off on terrorizing those who couldn't defend themselves, but I didn't. In fact, I was told by one of the cops I spoke to not to antagonize him under any circumstances. We don't know how far he'll push this if you make him angry. If it's possible, don't engage with him whatsoever. Like I said, that was my life for a whole 3 months. Until the day finally came when my mom got the call from our family's attorney saying a judge had finally approved the restraining order. For those wondering, it took so long because this guy had no history of actual violence, and the whole grabbing incident wasn't classed as an assault for whatever reason. The day it finally came, though, he must have gotten some kind of notification because he just stopped showing up altogether. Seeing him waiting outside whenever I finished was such a regular occurrence that when he finally didn't show up, I actually cried with relief. I told Carl, the Uber driver, that I thought I was finally free. We had a kind of celebration on that final drive back to my house. He still picks me up from time to time too, when I've been out drinking with my friends or for whatever. It's awesome to be reunited with him after such a sickening ordeal. I suppose half the reason I'm sharing this is to help other girls avoid going through the same thing I did. Don't hesitate to get the cops involved with something like a stalking issue. There are literally laws in place to help deal with things like that. But the big thing is don't ever show a soft side or seem like you're playing hard to get. If a guy shows you any unwanted attention, make it clear you'll just call the cops right away. Heck, carry a stun gun or pepper spray if you're legally able to, just to show that son of a bitch you're carrying so they leave you alone. I just don't want anyone else to go through what I went through, because honestly, I lost 4 months of my life to this guy's abuse. I used to have a job that was several miles away from my home. For the most part, I would ride my bike to work. It wasn't the best way of getting there because there weren't a lot of sidewalks or areas for it, but it sure as hell beat walking all the way there. About 6 years ago, I was working the closing shift. The sky had been looking rather foreboding all day long. This was my first winter working this particular job, and I hadn't thought much about how I'd get home if there was ever a snowstorm. I definitely could not ride my bike home in the snow, so I kept on hoping that oncoming snow would just wait until I got home before slamming down on us. Instead, though, it began snowing about 5 hours before my shift was over. I remember I even considered asking if I could go home early because of this, but I didn't in the end. Instead, I watched the snow fall down and kept hoping it would either stop or it wouldn't pile up so much that I couldn't get home. Of course, the snow does not listen to the whims of humans, though. About an hour before my shift was over, there was over a foot of snow on the ground already. The trucks hadn't gotten around to doing much work on it either. I knew there would be no way I would be able to ride my bike home now. Like I said, it was a few miles from my store to my apartment. I knew I would have to walk the entire way, and it would take a lot longer than a regular walk too. I'd be trudging through the snow ankle deep. It was going to be a miserable experience. I'd have to leave my bike at the store too. It's not like I could carry it there the entire way with me. Once I was out and on my way, It was even worse than I'd thought though. The wind was blowing hard, and the snow was smacking me right in the face. It was really stinging actually, and making me constantly have to close my eyes to even go forward. I tried to tell myself that I'd be happy when I got home at least. Making myself a cup of hot chocolate and some tasty soup, turning up the heat and just relaxing at home. There weren't that many cars that went by, but one actually stopped and pulled up close to me. The man rolled down his window and asked me if I needed a ride. Although I wasn't really into hitchhiking, I was ecstatic at the thought of not having to walk all the way there. Of course, I accepted and jumped into the car, thanking the man over and over. This enthusiasm didn't last long though. The man asked me where I was going, and I told him where my apartment building was situated. He started driving, and he seemed to be thinking really hard about something. Then he said the weirdest thing. "Well, that's a bit out of my way. How about you come and spend the night at my place instead?" The question surprised me. I wasn't about to do that, surely. Not to mention, my place was only 3 miles down the road. I was creeped out instantly, so I declined and inched away from the man. He seemed very perturbed, and I insisted on continuing to my apartment. It was only a few minutes away. I even offered to give him a few dollars for gas. He refused to give up though. He kept on talking about his house and said I would be able to get a really good rest there. Even said that he had a full liquor cabinet and that I could have whatever I wanted from it. I countered by saying I didn't drink and I couldn't sleep anywhere that was not my own bed. I told him to either take me to my apartment right now or let me out so I could just walk home. The man then just kind of exploded. He got furious, started yelling and smacking all over the car, saying he should just take me all the way back to my store and make me walk back from there while he watched. How dare I accuse him of having ulterior motives? Of course, I hadn't done that in the first place. I was freaked out now though, and I surely knew he had ulterior motives. I pressed myself up against the door of the car, and that's when his anger definitely got the better of him. He slowed down. He said he was going to take me away further from my home and drop me off in the middle of the woods by myself. He pulled into the parking lot of a store in order to turn around. Luckily for me, while he was turning, he slowed down just enough I figured I could leap out of the car, and I did. I leapt out into a bank of snow and tried to run. I'd left his door open, but I was slipping on the ice. I managed to catch my feet, and pretty quickly the man started screaming at me and tried to drive after me with his door still open. I ran up to the nearby store. It was closed, but there were still workers inside. I slammed on the doors and begged someone to let me in. I was scared of the man outside. The workers rushed over and let me inside. The man drove off soon after. They offered to call the police for me, but I declined. One of the workers was even nice enough to give me a ride home for free, so I still got to have my soup and hot chocolate in the end. But I don't think I'll ever be hitchhiking again. When I was growing up, I had a really good friend named Carl. Carl and I met in kindergarten, and we hit it off pretty much immediately. Pretty soon, we were doing everything together. When we were old enough to begin having sleepovers, we would spend every other weekend at each other's house and stay up late watching movies and playing video games. Mostly, we watched television together. This happened a long time ago. I'll never forget one particular night he spent over at my house though. I think I was about 12 years old. This happened a few weeks after Christmas, and this was on a Friday night. On the way home from school, we could tell it would be an interesting night. The sky had been completely overcast all day, and it wasn't just overcast. The clouds were extremely dark, as if they seemed to be bearing down on the world. The wind was blowing very fiercely. We could tell there was one hell of a storm on its way. So this night, Carl came over to my house to spend the night. We did all sorts of the typical stuff. Sloppy Joes for dinner, watched some movies. My parents went to bed pretty early, which was quite typical for them. Carl and I always stayed up really late when we were together. It was shortly before Carl arrived at my house that the storm finally hit, and it didn't start off slowly either. The snow immediately began impacting the earth quite hard and fast. It stuck and began building up right away. Actually, it was quite cool to look at because the snowfall was so thick it was hard to even see through. It was like watching a blanket of snow in the air. We went to my room on the second floor of the house, with my bed sitting next to the window. While we were playing Swords and Serpents, we could look outside and watch this amazing storm happening out there. It had been a few hours since my parents had gone to bed. Carl was right next to the window, sitting on my bed, while I was playing a little further away. Suddenly, though, he said, "Hey, I think there's something outside there." I really didn't believe him. We always tried to scare each other as best friends do. I just elbowed him and gave him a smirk. "No, man, I really mean it, look." I looked over him out the window. It was quite hard to see through the snow, but there was a shed in the backyard. It had a small light on its roof, and I could see the shadow of something out by that light. It seemed to be some sort of dog or something. I told him that, and he laughed, saying he knew it was a dog, but he was trying to freak me out. Carl decided he wanted to go into the backyard and check if the dog was okay. I told him that was pretty crazy because the snow had piled up pretty high already and wasn't showing any signs of stopping. He asked if he could go out and let the dog into the shed at least, seeing as how it was all alone at night in this ugly storm. I figured that at least was alright. I told him he was on his own though. I was not about to go out there in this weather. Carl put down his controller and went outside. I heard him going down the stairs and kept looking out the window, then back at the television out of the corner of my eye. I saw Carl outside moving towards the shed. I don't think he knew how hard it was going to be going over there though. I watched him very much in amusement. Yeah, he was my best friend, but who doesn't like seeing their best friend acting all silly? He walked through the yard, and I could see him a little more clearly when he made it to the shed. He began trying to pull the door open so he could let the dog in. I watched, laughing, because he hadn't noticed that it seemed the snow was making it difficult to open the door in the first place. While I was laughing at my best friend struggling though, I suddenly noticed another figure. There was a large man who had been hiding in the darkness. He quickly moved into the light of the shed and grabbed Carl. He slapped his hand over Carl's mouth, then lifted him off his feet. He pulled Carl away and into the darkness. Shocked, I immediately ran to my parents' room and began slamming on the door. My dad rushed over, and I told him what just happened. He told me to call the police and went to the closet and grabbed his gun. I called the cops and watched as my dad ran off into the darkness, out into the backyard. All I could do was wait for either the police to get there or for my dad to come back with Carl. I just kept on worrying about both Carl and my dad. All of a sudden, I heard a gunshot ring out in the night and felt my insides go cold. Right before the police finally arrived, my dad returned to the house soaking wet. He had his gun, and fortunately he had Carl with him as well. When the police arrived, my dad told them he was following the kidnapper. The man was very fast and clearly about to escape, so he fired a shot to let the guy know he was armed. That was when the man cut his losses and dropped Carl into a bank of snow. Fortunately, my best friend was okay for the most part. Neither he nor my dad ever got a good look at the guy, so he was never caught in the end. That was really hard on Carl, but he did eventually get over it. We went back to trying to beat Swords and Serpents. Little did we know back then that there was a bug in the game, and it was actually impossible to beat. Surely a story to tell for a long time. I used to build a snowman every year when I was a kid. It was always fun taking a small snowball, then rolling it into such a huge one. Hell, when I was done with most of my snowmen, they ended up being even bigger than I was at age 13. I recall being excited one particular night when the snow began to fall quite heavily. This excitement only escalated when I heard that school was going to be canceled the following day. This meant there was even more snowfall to be expected, and that meant I'd be able to build a killer snowman. The next day, I remember having hot cocoa and watching the snow falling from the living room window, knowing I would be having the time of my life. The following morning, yes, I was a dork and got up really early in the morning, got dressed, and ran out into the snow. I immediately sank down to my knees, but I didn't even care. I got right to work. When I was done with my snowman, I put my scarf on it and admired it. Then went inside to get a snack. While I was eating though, I noticed a guy I knew from school named Phil coming down my street. I felt a little bit alarmed because Phil was a bully from school. I watched him as he walked by. He noticed my snowman right on the edge of the yard at the sidewalk. He yanked the scarf and the hat off the snowman and started trying to reshape its head. I got up and ran outside. I screamed at him to stop it. The guy rolled up a snowball and threw it at me. It was hard and full of ice and smacked me right in the eye. My mom saw what was happening and ran outside, told Phil to get away from our yard. He gave my mom the finger and called her an old bitch. He invited her to make him get out of the yard. My mom told him, "Fine, I'll just call your mother." Then she did. Phil's mom was pissed off and promised my mom she would take care of it in the future. Phil would surely be grounded for a very long time. Satisfied, I went out and started to repair my snowman. I let myself forget all about Phil because I figured I was not going to be seeing him for quite a while. I was wrong though. The next day at school, he immediately started tormenting me, blaming me for him getting chewed out by his mom. He tried to start a fight with me, knocked me down and jumped on top of me. The principal came and broke up that fight luckily. He got suspended for a week. I figured on top of everything that had already happened, he would be in even more trouble with his mom. That night, I went to bed feeling very secure and happy, knowing this jerk would be in trouble for a long time. I woke up the next morning and immediately looked out my window at my snowman. I was terrified to see it had been vandalized overnight. Its head had been ripped off, and sitting on the ground was a large kitchen knife that had been inserted into it. The snowman was covered with blood, and written in the snow on the ground very carefully was, "You're next." Naturally, my mom saw this as well and got in contact with Phil's mom again. She said he'd actually disappeared the previous night, and she'd called the police because he never came home. I didn't see Phil ever again after, so I have no idea what happened to him. I thought he must have run off, but not knowing where he was made my life a lot worse, because I had no idea when he might decide to show up and take revenge on me, nor what he might do to me when he did. I remember my first job as a teenager. I was 16 years old and got myself a job in town. I was working in the used video game store. I got the job in the first place because I was trying to save up money to buy my first car. Obviously, this meant I had to walk to and from work every day. This happened in the late fall, so it got dark pretty early in the day. The store usually stayed open until 10 p.m., and I worked the closing shift. It wasn't too hard to get the store closed down and then get out the door very promptly. Usually, I would be out on my way around 10:30 or so. On this night, I noticed that when I left the store, it was unusually warm for this time of year. As I locked up the door, I soon discovered why. Right as I was doing so, lightning lit up the entire area. There was a storm on its way. In addition to the lightning, there was some very strong wind. Strong enough to almost blow me over more than once. It was inconvenient for walking, but actually, I kind of liked the atmospheric nature of this storm. I grew up in one of those really small towns that was pretty much all closed up by 9 p.m. This meant that by the time I was on my way, I truly felt very alone. To get to my house, I had to walk through town, then take a turn into an old neighborhood. There weren't many houses there. Most of them had been torn down long before I was even born. There was a large wooded area on the left side of the street. There were no street lamps either, so it was very, very dark in the woods. I have to admit that several times I was very nervous as I was walking by that area. The stormy night obviously didn't make it any better. It hadn't started raining yet, but I had just been witness to an amazing lightning show while walking home. The wind was so loud and hard too, it had to be blowing over 20 miles per hour. Despite the loud blowing of the wind though, I could have sworn at one point I began to hear someone walking in the wooded area alongside me. Now that was very scary. I wasn't one to really be scared of much usually. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, but that was hardly comforting. Even if it was an animal, it seemed to be very intent on following me along the street. You know how you convince yourself there's something happening, even if it really isn't, and when you do this, you become very preoccupied with the thought of it. Then it snowballs into a nerve-wracking episode. Well, that's exactly what was happening to me. I knew it was, too. I kept on glancing over at the woods, but finally my fears were realized when one of those area-brightening bolts of lightning lit up the entire woods. In that moment, I saw a man standing half-hidden behind one of the trees, holding what looked like a baseball bat. It was a quick flash of light. All that I saw was an outline after the lightning crack. Somehow, it seemed it was even darker than it was before it. I felt a twinge of pain in my eyes and had to squint when the thunder stopped rolling. I then distinctly heard the sounds of footsteps on the pavement in the dark. I felt freaked out. Anyone would have. I ran down the street at top speed. The entire time, I could hear the footsteps of the man coming after me. That just spurred me on to run faster. I sprinted down onto my street and was delighted to see the living room light on my house was on. That meant someone was up still. I ran to the house and grabbed the doorknob. I was fully expecting to be grabbed from behind when I held it. However, I was able to get into the house and close and lock the door behind me before anything happened. My little brother was sitting there on the couch, and I told him to call the police right away. I looked out the door window, and at first I didn't see anything. There was another bolt of lightning though, and I could see the shadow of the man standing in the middle of the street just in front of my house, looking inside. By the time the next flash of lightning shot down, he was already gone. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. I figure though he couldn't have been after me specifically. He was probably after anyone who happened to be walking along that street in the dark, but it really scared me half to death that night. I went to college in a historic mid-sized city in Florida, and at the time lived in a duplex downtown, maybe about 3 blocks from campus or so. The city is known to be pretty safe, and I lived in a pretty decent area with large historic homes near me. It took place about 3 years ago. A little backstory that will become relevant. The duplex I lived in had a front door that locked, and then both the upstairs and downstairs units had their own locking door as well. I lived downstairs and had 2 roommates, but this specific night only one of my roommates was home. We knew the girls that lived upstairs, but really only spoke to them in passing. When they moved in, we emphasized how important it was to us for them to keep the main front door locked at all times. They always made sure to do a really good job of doing so. So, me and my roommate are in for the night, knowing the front door is locked and smoking a few joints. At some point, we hear a knock at the front door and quickly realize the girls upstairs must have ordered a pizza. Later on, we came to find that they'd forgotten to lock the front door again after receiving that pizza. So, we finally go to sleep in our own rooms. Since I had a queen bed, I would often sleep with my phone and laptop right next to me in my bed. A couple of hours after I'd initially fallen asleep, I was suddenly woken up by something I didn't recognize at first. As I came to of it, I came to realize there was a man standing over my bed. As soon as I realized I was not dreaming, I noticed he was quickly moving my phone and computer off of my bed and moving my comforter as well, trying to climb in. I started asking the man who he was, what he's doing here. I was extremely confused and still groggy. I was also still slightly high from before I'd gone to sleep. The only thing he said to me, multiple times, was that he was just trying to get into bed. At this point, I began to panic, as my mind obviously went right to the worst. I was hoping that maybe my roommate had invited some random Tinder guy over and he'd simply gone to the wrong room. But the more I tried to question him, all he had to say was that he was going to get into bed with me. I did own pepper spray and a stun gun, but I had left them on a shelf that the man was right in front of, so there was no way I would be able to grab them without escalating the situation. Realizing I needed to do something quickly, I blurted out, "There are 5 people who live in this house, and if you don't get the fuck out right now, I will scream. They'll be here in seconds." Luckily, that was all it took to scare the man off. I don't know if he brought something with him or if he stole something from me, but I did see him grab at something in the dark and run out of my room. As soon as he left, I shut the door and locked it and tried to find my phone. I couldn't find it anywhere. Then I quickly realized that between my room and the front door was the room of my friend that was still home. As scared as I was in that moment, I was even more terrified that maybe the man had gone into her room. I grabbed my stun gun and my knife, counted to 3, and ripped open the door. I burst into my roommate's room, only to find her fast asleep. There was no evidence of the man still being around. I quickly woke her up and told her what happened, and she asked me if I was sure I wasn't dreaming. I even began to question myself until I walked out of her room and saw our front door wide open. I went to my room to search for my phone and finally found it, hidden under a pile of clothes across the room from where I'd left it earlier. That sent a chill up my spine, as I immediately knew for a fact someone had been in my house and room while I was sleeping, at least long enough to take and hide my phone. That only worsened my suspicions of his intentions. I ran back to my roommate's room, who at this point believed me. We barricaded ourselves in and called 911. Within minutes, there were cars swarming our street and yard, and they yelled for us to quickly leave the residence and run towards them. At least a dozen officers came rushing in and searched every inch of our apartment. We woke up the girls upstairs and searched their apartment as well to ensure the man had well and truly left. The officers had me write a statement, and I gave them a description of the man. To this day, I've never heard a single thing about the case. I just feel incredibly lucky with the outcome of the situation. The thought of his intentions terrifies me though, and additionally, the fact he was never caught scares me. I would hate for anyone to have to go through the pure fear I did. I will add there was a chance he might have been on drugs or mentally ill, and perhaps had no bad intentions. However, because he was never caught, I'll never be able to know. With the fact that he tried to hide my phone, I can only assume the worst. So I'm a pizza delivery girl. Easy enough. I was at work around 9:30 p.m. when this guy called in using a very whispery, breathy voice. I did my usual. "Thank you for calling Pizza Hut. This is Karen. How are you doing tonight?" After the usual exchange of small talk, I found out he was ordering for delivery. He was a new customer, so I had to put in all of his information fresh. I didn't notice anything weird initially. He told me he had a coupon for a pizza and asked if I could give him the discount. I told him I had to grab my manager so we could take care of that for him. He asked for me specifically to take care of him after I came back from dealing with my boss. I discounted him for his coupon and he thanked me. Here's where it started to get weird. He stopped me mid-sentence and told me I had a very nice-sounding tone of voice and he just loved to hear me talk. "You should be a disc jockey," he said. I was a little bit weirded out, but I tried to stay professional. I told him that was very sweet of him, and I would consider it in the future. "I'd listen to your radio station. Thank you for taking my order tonight. I'll stop by your store and see you sometime soon, Karen." I wish I could say that was the end of it, but that isn't true. I noted that this man lived in an apartment complex. What I didn't realize is I'd taken his complex's address and not his individual apartment number. Not 5 minutes later, the man called back, and my coworker Bob answered the phone. I learned after the fact that he had asked for me by my full name. I picked up the phone and did my usual greeting, and he reminded me that I'd forgotten to ask his apartment number. I changed the information for him, but before I could hang up, this was our conversation. "Hey, Karen." "Karen?" Yes, sir. How can I help you?" "Are you doing all right?" "Yeah, I'm great." "Good. I'm gonna hang up now. See you soon." Bob had heard the whole story and told my boss to have my male coworker take the call instead of me. When Bob came back, the very first thing he said to me was that the man had been asking where I was the entire time. Okay, so I get there, right, and I knock on the door, and he says in this weird voice, "Come in." I'm not about to go into this random guy's house, though, so I knocked again, and he opened the door with this big smile on his face. When he saw it was me, though, it just dropped instantly. I greeted him, and he said, "Oh, where's Karen?" I told him you weren't going to be able to make it, and he got so angry. After I took his money and gave him his food, he asked how you were. I told him you were doing all right, and he just said, "Good. Karen is a sweet girl. Tell her I'll see her soon." The fact that he asked the driver to come inside and that he was expecting me really creeps me out. Maybe he's just a lonely guy who wants someone to talk to, but still, I'm gonna add one more creep to my list. I wanted to tell you the story of a friend of mine named Angel. Angel is 19 and was honestly one of the brightest, cleverest, and most bubbly people I've ever met. She was obsessed with true crime stuff. She loved that TV program CSI and wanted to join the police so she could get into the forensic side of investigations. She loved the idea of using science to catch horrible criminals, but we never thought she'd end up being the victim of one herself. She had everything going for her in life, but then she met her ex-boyfriend Jay, and we saw a change in her right away. Jay made everything about him, and he abused Angel physically and mentally until she made everything about him too. She was miserable with him, but kept talking like he was just a tortured soul who needed a girl like her in his life to help fix him. We had to intervene time and time again to get her to see what a scumbag he was, who'd never be good for anyone. He was only ever interested in himself. It took ages to do this, but we finally managed to convince her to leave him. She told us all in a group chat that she'd finally told him they couldn't be together anymore. We were all so proud of her, but she also said that she was terrified of something he'd do to get back at her for this. As much as we knew that her dad, Patty, would never let anything happen to her while she was under his roof, we knew that he also couldn't protect her all the time. We knew that Jay was terrified of Patty himself, as they'd almost gotten into fights a few times before. Patty was way bigger than Jay and could easily beat the life out of him if it came to it, so he always stayed away from the house, just not far enough. I remember the day we found out that Angel was in the hospital. We were all hoping it wasn't anything serious, but then we heard she'd been hurt in a very serious incident. She'd fallen out of a van that was going down the highway somehow. We all just knew Jay had something to do with it. As it turns out, Jay had recruited the help of one of his friends. They'd waited in a van near Angel's house, waiting for her to come out. When they spotted her, Jay ran out, picked her up, then carried her to the van and threw her into the back of it. We still don't know what exactly went on inside that van. He insisted in court that he hadn't just thrown her out, but whatever he was doing or saying, it had scared Angel so much that she somehow found a way to open the back doors as it was running down the highway. She must have thought her only chance of survival was jumping out the back of that van. Some people say Jay pushed her out the back as a way to kill her, but at his trial, his lawyers were somehow able to prove that he had not pushed her, and all he wanted to do was keep her inside the van. He must have admitted to wanting to kidnap or scare her into getting back with him, but I know Angel. She wouldn't have done something so drastic, without being scared for her life. What happened next made it clear to me that the justice system in this country is just completely broken, because the sentence he got was nothing of what he deserved to get. Recently, he got his sentence more than doubled after a big public campaign headed up by her parents. That's all good and everything, but it still feels like nothing, because Angel's life is basically over now. She suffered serious head trauma after falling and being pushed from the back of the van, and now doctors think she'll be potentially disabled for the rest of her life. We don't know if she's ever going to walk, talk, or eat by herself ever again. Basically a death sentence. But the sentence Jay originally was going to get? Just over 4 years. Can you even believe that? This guy kidnapped his girlfriend, might have actually thrown her out the back of a van going 60 miles per hour, basically ended her life, and he was going to get out of prison in just 4 years. That's nothing. The driver of the van basically didn't get punished at all, and he also deserves to be in prison for the rest of his life. Angel once told me about a law in America, where if someone dies while you're committing a crime, your charge automatically gets turned into murder. I personally think we should have something like that here, too. It would make people think twice about doing things like kidnapping, or drunk driving, or anything that could end up ruining someone else's life. This happened 2 years ago now, but honestly, it feels like just yesterday that we found out Angel's life was over. This story took me quite a while to write out, as I'm not much of an author myself, and it's quite painful for me to relay. Hopefully, this will help someone though, as it's something I've wanted to share for quite some time. It involves 2 days in my life that I'd always thought were very fun, but somewhat weird, and how, when I grew up and was told what really happened, they've haunted me ever since. It all started when my dad's business partner came to pick me up from school one day. I knew him as Uncle Todd, and although I wasn't expecting him, I trusted him completely when he told me that my mom and dad were busy and he would be in charge of looking after me for a few days. I remember feeling kind of reluctant to get into his car for some reason. After all, Mom and Dad hadn't told me anything about this. I didn't really want to be away from them. But then he started promising me ice cream, a Game Boy, all this fun stuff. He also told me Mom and Dad had said I could watch whatever I wanted on the TV and that I was allowed to stay up until whenever I wanted to. Music to a kid's ears, right? So I got into his car and we drove off to his apartment, stopping to get some ice cream on the way. Todd was serious about the TV thing too, as he pretty much left me in his apartment on my own for hours on end. I remember he seemed to be very stressed out about something. I always assumed it was just grown-up stuff or something like that. I didn't really care much. I had all the Nickelodeon and McDonald's I could ever want. And that's how I spent the first night. It was also weird to me that Uncle Todd's apartment was so small that we both had to sleep in the same room. I still wasn't questioning anything though, because he was such a regular part of my life, and I trusted him completely. The next day, after more McDonald's and a bunch more Nickelodeon, Uncle Todd came back super stressed once again and told me to get into the bathtub. I thought he meant that I could take a bath or whatever, but that's not what he meant. He walked me over to the bathtub and made me get inside without any water in it and without taking my clothes off either. I could then hear him talking into the phone in the other room, trying to keep his voice down. I could still hear, though, how angry and stressed out he seemed to be at the person on the other end. Eventually, he went silent, put the phone down, and went to grab me out of the tub. I remember him putting me back on the bed and telling me he was going to get more McDonald's and ice cream for me. Then, as he went to walk out of the room, he picked up this pokey-looking thing in his hand, obviously to take out to his car. I remember asking him what that was, and he told me it was a thing for getting his car started on cold mornings. It hadn't even been that cold that morning or the morning before, but hey, at that age, grown-ups know best, right? Anyway, a few hours later, he drove me back to my parents' place, and they gave him a present for looking after me while they were gone. My mom and dad seemed really happy to see me, and I was really happy to see them too. They said they missed me, and I missed them a bunch as well. I didn't really think any further into it than that. It was only when I was all grown up that I was finally told what actually happened. You see, Uncle Todd and my dad really were business partners, but my dad was not exactly a good or honest person. He'd actually stolen a bunch of money from their business out from under Todd's nose, and he'd actually tried to rearrange some accounting so Todd wouldn't notice either. But Todd did notice, and he got very angry about this. He told my dad to give it back, or he was going to call the cops. My dad told him he'd already spent the money, and if he called the cops and got him thrown in jail, he was never going to get it back. Pretty scummy, I know, but my dad is generally an awful person all around, so I won't go too far into that. Either way, Todd turned out to be way more of a psycho than my dad figured, because instead of calling the cops and getting him arrested, he came up with another plan to get his money back. That's how he ended up showing at my school and convincing me to get into his car. My dad tried to give Todd all these promises that he'd pay him back and get all squared off, but Todd wouldn't believe him. He wanted his money back and he wanted it soon, so he grabbed me and let my mom and dad sweat it out for a day. He told them that if they didn't give him the money in 24 hours, he was going to kill me. Not exactly the best plan, but like I said, Todd was kinda psycho. He fed me McDonald's, gave me ice cream, and let me watch as much cable as I wanted to keep me from leaving what turned out to be the motel room. That's why, for the longest time, I thought motels were places people actually lived, and not places where people only rented a room for a few days or whatever. Then there's the whole bathtub thing. Todd put me in the bathtub that day and brought an ice pack because he was going to torture me while making my parents listen on the phone. That was what made them finally break, and they ended up selling a bunch of things and doing other shady stuff in order to get 10 grand worth of cash together in the space of a day. When they called to say that they had the money, Todd finally took me back home and grabbed the cash, which I'd thought was a gift for taking care of me, and then we never saw him again. Mom and Dad got a divorce not long after, which was sad, but a few of my friends' parents had gotten divorces too. I knew it was a thing that moms and dads occasionally did. I had no idea it was because of all the stealing and the kidnapping. It was also because Dad basically refused to go to the cops about what happened because he was too scared of going to jail himself. My mom just completely resented him after that. She also told me my dad told her if she tried to press charges against Todd, he was going to tell the cops she was in on the scam or whatever, and she would end up catching charges as well. Sometimes I think she might have actually been part of it, and that's why she didn't go to the cops right away when she found out Todd had taken me. I don't know, a lot about the story doesn't add up, but since I don't see my dad anymore, and my mom is the only member of my immediate family I'm close to, I don't exactly want to confront her about it. So, yeah, that's the story of my super messed up family, and how one of the weirdest, most fun times in my childhood turned out to be something completely horrible and kind of traumatic, honestly. In hindsight, it seems really scary, because I had no idea what was happening. It all seemed completely innocent, but I was minutes away from something out of a living nightmare, with my Uncle Todd doing all kinds of evil stuff to me in that bathtub, making me scream into the phone for my parents to hear. Let me start off by saying I'm a 16-year-old male and an only child who lives in a quiet rural area surrounded by fields in Amish country. I'm going to use the alias John for this story. One Saturday evening, after an afternoon of occasional rain showers, I was home alone while my parents were out for their anniversary. They had just recently left to go out when I decided to take a walk now that the rain had stopped for I don't know how long. I go into my garage, slip on my shoes, and head on out our sliding back door in our kitchen. The backyard was large and fenced in, as we used to have some dogs. There was a gate in the fence just off the patio that leads to our underground swimming pool, then another that leads into the side of our yard. I exited through there and headed down to my driveway and onto the road. I was out for maybe an hour or so when I finally returned from my rather simple exercise of walking up and down the road while waving to any friendly neighbors I saw. I walked towards my side yard when I noticed that the gate I'd exited out of earlier was still open. I must have forgotten to close and secure it, I thought to myself. It was a bit windy that day, so perhaps the wind had opened it up because I'd forgotten. Oh well. I headed through the gate, through our pool area, back onto the patio, and in through the sliding glass door. Later on, as the night began to set in further, I had just finished baking and eating half of a frozen DiGiorno stuffed crust pepperoni pizza when I heard one of the fence gates slowly creaking open. Obviously frightened, I thought at first maybe it was my mom or dad coming home early. They'd always call me when they were on their way home from wherever they were at though, so that surely couldn't have been it. I ran throughout the house and locked every door and window. I waited and listened in my kitchen for any further suspicious sounds. After about 5 minutes of not hearing anything else, I thought maybe it had just been my imagination, or maybe I'd again forgotten to lock the gate on my way in and the wind had blown it open again. I decided to quickly head outside and check it out. By now, it was completely dark and cloudy, so I grabbed a flashlight out of a drawer in the kitchen and crept out the front door. Once I was out on my driveway, I shone my flashlight down the side yard towards our shed. Okay, nothing there. So far, so good. I walked down the side yard slowly and was pointing my flashlight in every direction, keeping myself aware of my surroundings. Once I finally crept up to the gate, I saw it was wide open. Must have forgotten to lock it again, I thought to myself. I face-palmed. I shut it and locked it, then turned around to head back towards my driveway. All of a sudden, though, I noticed something out of the very corner of my eye in the darkness. My heart dropped as I shined my flashlight quickly towards my backyard and caught a glimpse of the backside of somebody walking behind my shed. From what I saw, I could make out that this was a person with dark hair wearing a black hoodie and sweatpants, and they appeared to be carrying something in their left hand. I could just barely make out what appeared to be the blade of a knife or some sort of small, sharp instrument. At this point, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know whether to confront this person or go inside and call my parents. I stood frozen for a few seconds, hand trembling, as I finally decided to call my mom. After 2 rings, she picked up. "Hello, John. You need something, sweetheart?" she asked. I felt a bit more comfortable now. "Yeah, Mom, I think there's someone in our yard," I said, taking a deep breath. My mom gasped, and her voice got a bit frantic. This was the first time something like this had ever happened. "Where are you now?" I continued looking out towards my shed, now lit up by the flashlight. I could no longer see the person anywhere. "I'm out on the driveway. I heard the gate open and went outside to check it out. I saw someone. He was walking toward the back side of the shed and carrying something. I think it's a knife or something like that." My mom gasped again, and this time I heard my dad ask what was wrong. She told him what happened as I stood there and eyed for any movement. "We're heading home right now. Call 911. Don't go chasing him or anything stupid like that." "All right, Mom. I'm going back inside right now." After exchanging our farewells, I turned around to rush back into the house. Once I turned the corner to head back to my front door, though, I saw somebody walking down the road right in front of me. My heart sank as I stood there in shock, ready to flash my flashlight at whoever this was. The person stopped walking and stood still for a couple of seconds before slowly turning their head in my direction. They must have heard me walking as well. I instinctively whipped the light up and shined it at the person's face. It was a male, I don't know how old, dressed in a black zip-up hoodie and black sweatpants. No doubt it was the same person I'd seen behind my shed. I could only see one of his eyes, as the other was completely covered by something. He looked at me with this blank, expressionless face. It almost felt like he was glaring directly into my soul. This time, I didn't see his knife, but he did have his hand in his hoodie pocket. Without a single word or facial gesture, he slowly began to walk backward before turning around and continuing down the road. After a few seconds, I ran up the road in front of my house and peered down it. I didn't see him anymore. He must have entered someone else's yard. I ran back inside and waited for my dad and mom to get home, as I called police in the meantime. Once a state trooper arrived, I told them everything, from the gate being fondled with to the encounter I'd had with him in front of my house. The trooper told me there had been several calls in the past few months about a person matching that description I gave them, being spotted in several different areas, acting very suspiciously. That interested me greatly, I must say. I tried to ask him more about it, but he declined to answer. Once my parents arrived, they talked with the trooper a bit before he finally left. Afterwards, my parents and I talked about what happened before sitting down to watch a movie, which made us all fall asleep together. Nothing much changed after that night, though. I still live here, and my parents still let me stay home alone, but we've gotten a home security system just in case, and I'm more vigilant whenever I'm by myself. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.